New York City in the 1850s was a machine that consumed people. Ships arrived at the docks daily, unloading Irish families fleeing famine and Germans escaping revolution. By 1850, the city's population had swelled past 500,000, and it kept climbing. The poorest crowded into neighborhoods like 5 Points, where entire families lived in single windowless rooms and a single water pump served hundreds. Cholera outbreaks in 1849 and typhus swept through these blocks, killing parents and leaving children behind. Estimates from the era claim that as many as 30,000 homeless children roamed the streets of Manhattan. They were called street Arabs and gutter snipes. Some were true orphans. Many had living parents too poor, too sick, or too drunk to keep them. Boys as young as 6 sold matches and newspapers, blacked boots, and slept in doorways, alleys, and packing crates. Girls swept crossings for pennies and were pulled into worse. Winter was a death sentence. Each cold season, bodies of children were found frozen in stairwells. To survive, thousands turned to theft, forming gangs that police could not control. The city's answer was punishment. Children as young as 8 were arrested and jailed alongside hardened adult criminals in institutions like the Tombs. Others were warehoused in almshouses and orphan asylums that were overcrowded, underfunded, and grim. The House of Refuge, opened in 1825, packed juvenile offenders into cells. These institutions could not absorb the sheer volume. Reformers who walked these streets described a crisis that seemed to have no bottom. Every wave of immigration added more mouths, more fever, more abandoned infants left on church steps and in doorways. The wealthy uptown looked away. The newspapers ran alarmist stories about a rising generation of criminals bred in the slums, a dangerous class that would one day overwhelm respectable society. Something, everyone agreed, had to be done, but no one knew what. Prisons and asylums only multiplied the misery. The old solutions were failing on a scale America had never seen. Into this drowning city, in 1853, walked a young minister with a radical theory about where these children truly belonged, and it lay far beyond the horizon of Manhattan. His name was Charles Loring Brace, and he was 26 years old when he took charge of a new organization in 1853. Born in Connecticut in 1826 and educated at Yale, Brace had trained for the ministry, but found his calling not in a pulpit but in the streets. He had walked through 5 Points, visited the prisons, and talked with the children other men saw only as threats. He rejected the idea that these children were criminals by nature. He believed they were shaped by their environment, and that the environment itself was the disease. On his return from travels through Europe, where he had studied poverty and reform, Brace helped found the Children's Aid Society in February 1853. His theory was as simple as it was audacious. The city, he argued, could never save these children. Its slums, saloons, and asylums would only corrupt them further. What they needed was work, fresh air, family, and above all, the open country. Brace looked west, to the vast farmlands of the expanding American frontier. There, he believed, families were hungry for extra hands to work the land and would welcome children into their homes, raising them as their own. He called this idea placing out, and it rested on a romantic faith in rural Christian virtue as the great corrective to urban decay. The Children's Aid Society opened lodging houses and industrial schools, but Brace considered these mere way stations. The real solution was relocation. He wrote pamphlets, raised money from wealthy donors, and preached his vision relentlessly. Farm families would gain labor and love, children would gain salvation. There would be no formal adoption papers, no long-term contracts, few binding legal protections. Brace trusted that good homes and honest work would do the rest. Critics existed even then, warning that children might be exploited or lost. But Brace's confidence was unshakable, and his cause caught fire among reformers desperate for any answer. All he needed now was to prove it could work. In the autumn of 1854, he prepared to send his first group of children out of the city and onto the rails. On September 20th, 1854, the first company departed. 45 boys and girls, gathered from the streets and lodging houses of New York, boarded a train bound for Dowagiac, Michigan, a farming town roughly 700 miles away. An agent of the Children's Aid Society traveled with them, responsible for feeding, guiding, and ultimately distributing them upon arrival. The children had been scrubbed, given new clothes, and told they were going to find families. Many had never left Manhattan. The journey took days, the cars rattling westward through Pennsylvania and Ohio, and into the Michigan woods. When they reached Dowagiac, the agent announced their arrival in local churches and posted handbills. Farmers came to look them over. Within days, most had been taken. The remainder were sent on to the next town down the line. Brace declared the experiment a success, and the machinery began to grow. What started with a single company of 45 became a system. The Children's Aid Society organized regular shipments, and other institutions soon copied the model. The New York Foundling Hospital, run by the Sisters of Charity, began sending infants and toddlers on what became known as baby trains, often prearranged with Catholic families through parish networks. Railroad expansion made it all possible. As tracks pushed into Indiana, Illinois, Missouri, Kansas, Nebraska, and beyond, the trains followed. Agents scouted destinations, secured local committees of clergymen and businessmen to vet applicants, and printed circulars advertising the coming arrivals. Each train carried anywhere from a dozen to more than 100 children. They rode in ordinary passenger cars, sometimes sleeping in their seats for a week, tended by one or two overwhelmed agents. Over the following decades, the numbers climbed into the thousands each year. By the peak, the trains ran continuously, distributing children across at least 45 states, and even into Canada and Mexico. The total, gathered slowly over 75 years, would eventually reach an estimated 250,000. But the moment that defined each child's fate came not on the long ride west. It came in the final hour, on a wooden platform, before a crowd of strangers deciding whether to take them home. The arrival was advertised days in advance. Handbills nailed to storefronts and notices in the local paper announced that a company of children would be available on a given date at the town hall, the opera house, or the train depot itself. On the appointed day, the children were lined up on a stage or a platform for public inspection. They stood in rows, often wearing numbered tags, while townspeople filed past. This was the moment the whole journey had been building toward, and it unfolded with brutal efficiency. Prospective families were invited to examine the children directly. Farmers squeezed arms and shoulders to test for muscle. They checked teeth, the way one might inspect a horse or an ox at market. They asked children to speak, to walk, to demonstrate they were healthy and strong. Older boys who looked capable of heavy labor were often chosen first, prized as workers for the fields. Pretty infants and small girls appealed to women wanting a child to raise. The sickly, the disabled, and the older children who understood too much were frequently passed over. The agent presided, sometimes reading aloud each child's name and background, sometimes urging the crowd to take them. Placements happened in minutes. A handshake, a signature on a simple agreement, and a child was gone with strangers, their entire future decided by a first impression. Some families genuinely wanted a son or daughter. Others wanted cheap hands and said so plainly. There were minimal safeguards. The stated rules asked that children be schooled, clothed, and treated as family, but enforcement depended on distant agents who might visit once, if ever. The children themselves had little say. A frightened 5-year-old could not negotiate. Those not selected climbed back aboard and rode to the next town to stand on another platform, the process repeating until someone took them or the train ran out of stops. Contemporary observers used the word auction, though no money changed hands. For the children, the terror was concrete and immediate, and for those who arrived with a brother or sister still holding their hand, The platform held a particular cruelty, because families rarely wanted more than one. They had survived together. On the streets of New York, brothers and sisters had shared crusts of bread, huddled for warmth, and protected one another when no adult would. Many had lost their parents but still had each other, and that bond was often the only stable thing in their lives. The trains ended it in an afternoon. On the platform, families chose one child, rarely two. A farmer needed a single strong boy, not his younger brother. A woman wanted a baby girl, not the older sister who came with her. Agents, under pressure to place everyone, allowed the separations to happen. A child taken in Iowa might never learn that a sibling had gone to a family in Missouri, or Kansas, or 3 states farther down the line. Sometimes the parting was sudden and silent. A child pulled from the group before the others understood what was happening. Sometimes it came with screaming, small hands clutching at each other and being pried apart by strangers. Names were changed by new families. Records, when they existed at all, were kept in scattered ledgers by different agencies, often incomplete or lost. A child adopted at age 3 might grow up with no memory of having had a brother, only a vague ache and a story their new parents never told. Some agents tried to place siblings in the same town so they could visit. Many did not. The distances of the American interior swallowed the connections whole. What followed, for those who remembered, was a lifetime of searching. Grown men and women placed advertisements in newspapers describing a sister last seen on a platform in 1887, a brother whose real surname they no longer knew. They wrote letters to the Children's Aid Society begging for the names of the families that had taken their kin. Some searches lasted 50 years. A few ended in tearful reunions on train platforms decades later. Most ended in silence, in letters that came back unanswered, in graves visited too late or never found at all. For every child the train saved, they carried a wound. And even as siblings vanished from each other's lives, some of those children were riding toward futures brighter than New York could ever have offered. For every child who suffered, another found a life that would have been unimaginable on the streets of New York. In the farmhouses of Indiana, Kansas, and Missouri, some children were welcomed not as workers but as sons and daughters. They were given beds of their own, new names, and a place at the family table. They learned to read in one-room schoolhouses, attended country churches, and inherited farms they had helped to build. For thousands, the Orphan Train was exactly the deliverance Charles Loring Brace had promised. Consider Andrew Burke and John Green Brady, both placed out from New York in 1859. Both rode the trains as small, forgotten boys. Both would become governors, Burke of North Dakota, Brady of the Alaska Territory. 2 governors from a single trainload of the discarded. Their stories became the program's proudest evidence, cited for decades as proof that open country could redeem what the city had ruined. Others rose to become doctors, teachers, ministers, and merchants. A boy named Lee Nailing, placed with a Texas family, remembered his adoptive father meeting him at the station and simply saying, "You'll do." Decades later, he wrote that those were the kindest words he had ever heard. Children who had scavenged garbage for food now sat down to Sunday dinners. Children who had slept in doorways now had quilts sewn by hands that would come to love them. Some families formally adopted their placed-out children, changing wills and passing down land. Reunion letters, preserved in the Children's Aid Society archives, brim with gratitude, men and women in their 70s thanking the agents who had put them on the train. For these children, the platform had been a doorway, not an auction block. The frontier had given them what the tenements never could: air, food, schooling, and a name. These were the outcomes Brace held up to donors and skeptics, the faces printed in annual reports. But the society counted its successes far more carefully than its failures. Behind every governor and grateful farmer stood children whose fates were never recorded, never visited, never rescued from the homes that received them. Their suffering went uncounted. The same system that produced governors also delivered children into hands that saw them only as free labor. On isolated farms far from any oversight, a placed-out child could vanish into a life of drudgery. Boys as young as 7 rose before dawn to feed livestock, plow fields, and haul water until their hands bled. Girls scrubbed floors, tended infants, and cooked for households that never called them family. They were fed last, clothed in cast-offs, and denied the schooling the Children's Aid Society had promised. The contracts said children under 12 were to be treated as members of the family, but the society could not enforce what it could not see. Agents were meant to visit each child, yet with thousands scattered across dozens of states, follow-up collapsed into paperwork. A single form letter, mailed once a year, was often the only contact. Many were never checked on at all. Some children were beaten, some were starved. Some were sent from home to home, rejected each time, growing harder and lonelier with every move. Others simply ran. The records hold accounts of boys who fled in the night, walking miles of railroad track back toward the only place they knew, the city that had thrown them away. One placed-out child, Teresa Martin, later recalled being made to sleep in a shed and eat scraps while the family's own children slept indoors. Another remembered being whipped for crying over the siblings he had lost at the platform. These voices survived only because a few grew up to speak them aloud, decades later, when researchers finally came asking. Most did not. The abused, the overworked, the ones who died young on strangers, farms. They left no letters, no reunion photographs, no annual report testimonials. They are the uncounted, the children the numbers cannot reach. For 75 years the trains rolled on, carrying salvation and suffering in the same railroad cars. But the world that had launched them was changing. New ideas about childhood, poverty, and the state's duty to the vulnerable were rising, ideas that would finally bring the trains to a halt. By the early 20th century, the assumptions behind the orphan trains were crumbling. A new profession, social work, was taking shape, and its practitioners looked at Brace's methods with alarm. Placing children with strangers 1,000 miles away, with almost no investigation and almost no follow-up, struck reformers as reckless. The very informality that had let the Children's Aid Society move so many children so fast now looked like negligence. Progressive reformers argued that poverty itself, not the city, was the enemy, and that the answer was to help families stay together, not to scatter their children across the map. Mothers, pension programs, beginning in Illinois in 1911, gave impoverished widows money to keep their children at home. States built licensing systems, background checks, and supervised foster care. The idea took hold that a child's placement should be documented, monitored, and matched to a specific home, not decided in minutes on a train platform. The receiving states also began to resist. Communities in the Midwest and West grew weary of what they saw as the East shipping its problems westward. Some claimed the trains delivered delinquents and troublemakers who burdened local jails and poorhouses. State legislatures passed laws restricting or banning the importation of dependent children across their borders. Michigan, Indiana, Illinois, Minnesota, and others required bonds, inspections, or outright refused shipments. The frontier that Brace had imagined as an endless open field for placement was closing, county by county, statute by statute. Charles Loring Brace had died in 1890, and the society he founded slowly shifted toward supervised foster care within New York itself. The great westward trains dwindled. The last recorded orphan train departed in 1929, carrying a small group to Texas, the final run of a system that had moved 250,000 children over 75 years. The rails fell silent. What remained was a vast, scattered human legacy, hundreds of thousands of lives reshaped, and millions of descendants who would one day trace their origins back to a station platform. The trains had stopped, but their story was far from finished. It was only beginning to be understood. When the last train stopped, it left behind a nation quietly reshaped. An estimated 250,000 children had been carried west, planted in thousands of towns from Ohio to California. Their descendants now number in the millions, Americans who may never know that their family tree begins with a frightened child on a railroad platform, holding a numbered tag and a small cardboard suitcase. For decades, most riders kept silent. Many were ashamed of their origins or had been told nothing at all. Adoptive families sometimes hid the truth. Some riders learned only in old age that they had come on the trains. But beginning in the late 20th century, the survivors started to speak. They gathered at reunions in Kansas and Arkansas, comparing memories, tracing roots, searching for siblings lost at platforms 70 years before. The National Orphan Train Complex in Concordia, Kansas, opened to preserve their stories, gathering photographs, letters, and the handwritten records that could finally reconnect scattered families. Some reunions succeeded. Brothers separated as small children met again as gray-haired men, recognizing each other across a lifetime of absence. Others searched forever and found only silence. A name on a manifest, a town that no longer existed, a grave. Historians and genealogists still comb through Children's Aid Society ledgers, matching numbers to names, restoring identities the system had blurred. Every recovered record is a small act of repair against decades of forgetting. The Orphan Trains defy any single verdict. They were at once an audacious rescue and a vast, unregulated gamble with human lives. They pulled children from lethal poverty and delivered some into love, education, and even high office. They also tore siblings apart, handed children to strangers who wanted labor, and abandoned thousands to fates no one ever recorded. Brace believed he was saving them, and for many he was. For others, the train was the beginning of a second, quieter kind of loss. Both truths departed from the same stations, rode the same rails, and arrived in the same towns. That is the enduring paradox of the orphan trains, and the truth their descendants still carry. Salvation and abandonment rode the same train.